Hi everyone. Today we are looking at week 11 of Theories in Counselling, and we're going to be looking at one of the most important theories that you'll learn, and the only one supported by Medicare, I believe, which is CBT, Cognitive Behaviour Therapy. So let's get straight into it. It is quite a long lecture, but I think it should be pretty interesting, and certainly one that you should think about in terms of your final assessment. So cognitive behaviour therapy. So last week we looked at rational emotive behaviour therapy with Albert Ellis. REBT techniques included using the ABCD and E model, or we've just got here the ABC model, the activating event, the belief and the consequence. And the client and the counsellor there don't necessarily need to have that warm relationship. Certainly it has to be congruent. It absolutely has to be congruent, and it must be unconditional positive regard, for there to be that trust and the rapport. But it doesn't necessarily have to be warm, because if you remember with REBT, there is a sense there that you're expecting to be challenged. You better stop thinking this way, and you better become self-disciplined. That was one of the statements made. If you have any questions, please make sure you speak to your lecturer. So today we're going to identify the goals of CBT and describe the therapeutic relationship in CBT, explain the importance of assessment and case formulation, and explain the importance of monitoring progress. We describe the techniques used in CBT and the pros and cons, the advantages and limitations of CBT. So here are your readings, and they are to be found on Moodle. So what is CBT? Cognitive Behaviour Therapy. Just even in those couple of words, cognitive, mental processes, behaviour, the way that we act, and the therapy is related to how those mental processes and the way that we act, so our behaviour, how they link together. And we started this with Albert Ellis, didn't we? We started thinking about thoughts, feelings, behaviour, and so forth. And CBT is very, very much related to the way that REBT works. So CBT comprises a range of techniques focused on altering the person's unhelpful beliefs, thoughts, behaviour, and emotional responses. Notice there's no mention of rational behaviour. We talk about irrational beliefs. We talk about unhelpful beliefs. Okay, so unhelpful beliefs, thoughts, behaviour, and emotional responses. So there's no judgment on the type of thinking that you have. Okay, it is based on the principles of behaviourism and cognitive therapy. So they are two different sort of strains, I guess, of therapy that have come together. And when you've linked them together, you realise that they're actually connected. So it's that sort of mind-body connection. What I think, relates to what I do. How can I change what I do and how I feel based on how I think? That's pretty much it. CBT has been applied to a range of disorders: anxiety, GAD, which is general anxiety disorder, social anxiety, and OCD, which many of you know is compulsive disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's also depressive disorders like dysthymia. Good one. So that's an ongoing, very, very ongoing, long-term depression. And MDD, which is major depressive disorder. Your recovery after psychosis. So some people experience psychosis, generally associated with, the types of illnesses that psychologists or psychiatrists would treat. So schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. But the recovery after that, a counsellor may be able to assist with that CBT component. So once you've come off, those psychotic episodes and you're on medication and so forth, and you're ready to reintegrate, there might be some CBT that a counsellor could assist with. Also adjustment problems, adjusting to a new life in a different country, adjusting to the death of a person, sort of deals with loss there, and adjustment, and also eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, those sort of things, and childhood problems such as ADHD, ODD, and CD. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so where a child cannot focus because they're kind of constantly moving around. And these disorders are mainly around that attention, so focusing. So what the aim then is to get CBT to teach them how to focus. So CBT uses a collaborative approach to conceptualization and therapy. So when we say collaborative, it means that we're using kind of CBT, in a way that sort of probably sits with other types of therapy. So it's only effective for clients who actively want to get better or those who want to work towards their recovery. So not only it sits with other therapies, it sits in terms of the client has to be a part of it, has to want to has to kind of commit to this sense of I want to get better, I want this to happen for me. So it's collaborative in many ways, and here are some ways in which that it's collaborative. So, just going around a circle there. EMDR is an eye movement type of therapy. Hypnosis, you would have heard of. Solution-focused brief therapy, we're going to learn next week. Life coaching, motivational interviewing, and so on and so forth. So in and around all these different types of therapies, CBT sits as, part of a toolkit, referring to our first lecture. So the underpinning principles of CBT are that there's faulty or maladaptive thinking that leads to unhelpful or negative behaviours. We sort of visited that with REBT, didn't we? Whereas there it was called irrational. Positive behaviours can be developed by helping the client generate positive thoughts. So once you generate a positive thought, it is believed, or it is the goal of CBT, that a behaviour that fits that new positive thought will follow. And clients can be taught to develop positive and self-enhancing thoughts and behaviour. And that's really the basis of it, that the belief with CBT is that you can be taught how to think differently. You can be taught how to input kind of different thoughts that will output different behaviours. And for some people that's really fundamental, because it is their thinking, it's their maladaptive thinking. And I'll explore what that word really means. That maladaptive thinking that leads to this behaviour, which then leads to feeling really bad. And so maladaptive thinking, develops when we think certain things about issues that we're having that really don't serve us very well. And so they're not adaptive. They're not helpful. They're not going to help us. They're going to do the opposite. And we have maladaptive thinking about many, many things in life. We'll go through some examples soon. The underpinning principles of CBT are as follows. The counselling is a collaboration between the client and the counsellor. And counselling sessions are structured and focused on the problems, and counselling is time limited. Interventions and techniques are based on scientific research and evidence. So this is one of the major reasons why CBT is so popular. The amount of research that has been created to support CBT, or to test whether CBT works or not, is very, very large in volume compared to the other therapies. And so, for example, I mentioned at the beginning that CBT is, a preferred therapy in terms of what Medicare will cover. That is because it's so evidence-backed. The scientific research and evidence is very large and seems to show time and time again in a reliable manner that CBT, when conducted appropriately, leads to a change in behaviour, which leads to the betterment of the client. And I mean, this is what these kind of 4 points are what make it so popular. I suppose it's time limited. You don't have to keep going time and time again. I think 6 to 7 sessions of CBT is what's needed to, according to the research, to alter maladaptive thinking and maladaptive behaviour. So what do clients learn in CBT? So CBT involves learning how to change your thoughts. So there's an element of psychoeducation in CBT. First of all, you've got to learn that you have thoughts, and that those thoughts are much like input into a computer, little components that can be substituted for other things, and we call those cognitions. And that your actions or behaviours, which is why it's called cognitive behaviour therapy, lead to different outcomes. So why is this important? Because in any given situation, you will have thoughts and feelings about it and behave in a certain way. So these thoughts, feelings, and actions all interact and influence each other. And the best way to understand them is to think about a triangle. So look at all this psychoeducation. And this all goes on with CBT. And I think that's also a really positive element of CBT. Not many people get psychoeducation. They don't get to sort of think about themselves in terms of, a structure or a framework. They're kind of at the mercy of their own thoughts and behaviours without ever really thinking, hey, why do I do this, or why do I think this or feel this? And so CBT involves a fair amount of psychoeducation. So your thoughts lead to behaviours, which lead to feelings, and it's a cycle. You will recognise this from REBT. So let's go to an example of a fear of dogs. Imagine a situation where you're walking down the street and you see a dog, and you might expect to feel afraid. So to think that that dog will bite, and to run away or avoid the dog in some way. So we know that as humans, we have automatic reactions, fight or flight. We've learnt about that. And perhaps when we see the dog, we have instant thoughts about that dog. And here we have an example. That dog will bite me. And our behaviour might be to run away. And our feelings thereafter are feelings of fear. However, if we imagine that you have a friend who is not afraid of dogs and actually likes them very much, your friend's thoughts, feelings and actions might be very different. Same situation, they see a dog, yet their thoughts are, what a nice dog, I want to pet it. And their behaviour is to pet the dog, and their feelings are happy. So we need to remember that the one thing to notice in these two examples is that the situation did not change. But if you change your thoughts, then your feelings and actions will change as well. So, do you think that as a counsellor, you could be content with helping clients make small behavioural changes? Or do you believe that deeper changes are necessary to bring about long-term changes in living? And this is a really important question, because if we think back to one of our first sessions when we talked about our theoretical orientation, now we're at sort of the final weeks of our course, and we've got to be starting to think, hey, you know what? I'm more of a let's get into the nitty-gritty of the past. Let's figure out what it's all about. Kind of try to solve it, right? So I'm more psychodynamic, kind of Adlerian maybe. Or I'm more, all of that stuff is whatever it is. Pretty much the here and now is what helps people to cope on a day-to-day basis. Maybe going through all that is not necessary. Maybe what we need to do is just make these small behavioural changes to help the person cope and have a better life. And that betterment of their life will result in long-term happiness, which is ultimately, isn't it, the goal of all therapy, for the person to thrive and succeed independently. So which one do you tend to lean towards? Have a think about that. Maybe write about that in Moodle as a reflection. Here is a clip in regards to CBT. I live out regionally, so my internet is exceedingly slow.
One of the challenges in this work is knowing enough about
Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is the bread and butter of all psychotherapeutic modalities. This is because it's one of the few empirically valid talk therapeutic practices proven in clinical trials to effectively treat depression and anxiety. Certain fundamental aspects of CBT have been identified in various ancient philosophical traditions, particularly in Stoicism. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus believed that logic could be used to identify and discard false beliefs that lead to destructive emotions. This influenced the way modern CBT therapists identify cognitive distortions that contribute to depression and anxiety. CBT was originated from Aaron Beck in cognitive therapy, which was later developed into CBT, and Albert Ellis, who created rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, and came up with the ABC method. Let's look at an example of this, starting with the activating event. Let's say your girlfriend tells you to put the toilet seat down. A lot of people know this scenario. After the event occurs, it goes through our filter of perceptive beliefs, where we add subjective meaning to the event with our thoughts. A lot of guys would have an error in thinking and take it personal by saying something like, "She thinks I'm lazy." Then the resulting emotion would be anger, and you saying something like, "Why the hell should I? She's such a nag." Then finally, the resulting behavior would probably be a fight. Beck emphasized the importance of two people having drastically different thoughts about similar events based on our beliefs and the way we see the world. Therapists attempt to make the client aware of these negative thoughts or cognitive errors. One technique is to challenge them by simply reframing them. Let's look at a couple more of these beliefs that don't coincide with reality. Let's say one morning you wake up to birds chirping and you're angry. You're angry because you don't want to go to work. Then later that day, it begins to rain, and you just can't help but complain about that too. But what if you got a full night's sleep, and the first thing you did in the morning was realize how grateful you are to have another day to experience life? And then when it inevitably rains later that day, it reminds you of your childhood stomping in puddles. And you think to yourself, this is awesome. Humans are very emotional creatures. We make decisions and perceive our world based off how we feel in the moment. Major companies know this, so they market to people's emotions rather than their logic. We see the world through the lens of our emotions. This is known as a mental filter or emotional reasoning. We also tend to make assumptions about how good we are at something or about how an event will go based on previous similar events. However, when reality goes against our expectations, we become sad, angry, and depressed. These assumptions are known as jumping to conclusions. Have you ever been late to work, and while you're rushing there you think, oh my gosh, my boss is going to get mad at me, he's going to yell at me, and I'm going to get fired, and I'll probably end up homeless on the streets. People who do this exaggerate the importance of problems, shortcomings, and minor annoyances. This is known as magnification or catastrophizing, where we think of the worst possible outcome in a given situation. CBT works because it makes our oftentimes unaware internal processes and habitual behaviors noticeable. And it shows you that each of these processes are all connected to each other. However, there is one criticism that I want to point out to you about CBT. Recent research by Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the book Happiness Hypothesis, says that our emotions actually are the old software that has been developing for thousands and thousands of years. And our higher cognitive part of the brain in the frontal part of the lobes is like the new software. So in reality, what really happens is an activating event occurs, we always experience the emotion first. Then our cognitive process comes in like a little lawyer to explain that said emotion. We may not be able to control how something makes us feel at first, but we can choose how to think and act on those feelings. Let me know in the comments below what cognitive error you guys fall for most. And as always, thanks for watching. Until
Okay, some of the things that I want to highlight from that little video was CBT based on Stoicism, and we covered Stoicism in our previous lecture on RABT. And that kind of became a bit of a criticism that it's, you're expected to just be logical about everything. And CBT is like that. It is really based on finding kind of the logical or the adaptive. Now, it doesn't use these sort of terms, but the adaptive or the most adaptive. In other words, the most logical way to think about a thing so that you don't end up feeling bad. And they gave that example of, with your girlfriend asking you to put the toilet seat down and you thinking, oh, she's such a nag. Well, the logical thing would be to think, hey, she just wants a clean house. It's not about you. It's not about nagging you or that you're lazy and so forth. It really is logically associated with something else. And so you can avoid all that other behavior like fighting and so on just through thinking logically. That's kind of what CBT is about. And he went through a little bit there of what our emotional reasoning is. So, that because we seem to feel things first rather than thinking, what was that original thought, we make a whole lot of decisions based on emotional reasoning. That criticism in regards to CBT is that latest research suggests that the emotion first kind of thought later theory is correct, and that our thoughts explain our emotions rather than our emotions explain our thoughts. And so, you might want to look into that further for yourself. But for the moment, we're going to stick with the idea that CBT is a behavioural change type therapy, which can lead to some overall good goals. So the overall goal of CBT is to bring about client change. The focus is not on understanding the client's deeply seated issues or exploring the past as in psychodynamic counselling, but on the immediate problem the client is experiencing. So it would be interesting to compare psychodynamic counselling and CBT in terms of how you would, how you would manage the treatment with a particular client or case study. The aim is to help the client develop positive and helpful thinking and appropriate and self-enhancing behaviours and feelings. And this is done through a structured and systematic process that involves assessment, interventions, progress monitoring and relapse prevention, throughout which the client is taught to manage their problems. So there are a number there of different components. There's assessment, intervention, progress monitoring and relapse prevention. And so the goal too, which is implied here, is that it is a form of, here's the tools, you go out and you do it for yourself type therapy. So a bit of self-help really. And to achieve these steps, discussion of the unique aspects of the presenting problem and its context, there has to be that discussion. There needs to be psychoeducation and problem solving to help clients change behaviour and reconstruct their thoughts. And this is, these areas, or this is an area in which a emerging CBT therapist, one who doesn't have as much experience, might kind of get it wrong. That problem solving comes with experience, and it comes with knowledge and understanding of a variety of experiences in life. And when you're young, you can't have those. It's just stands to reason. So perhaps not so much about youth, but definitely about experiences. So, newly developed counsellors or newly graduated counsellors should get a lot of experience in watching other CBT therapists so that they can see how, how to make linkages and how to problem solve or help the clients problem solve. And the other issues are, being able to ascribe the right, sort of kind of hone in on the thinking and being able to help the client to readapt his behaviour through different thinking. That's also tricky. And so the CBT therapist must hold the following traits: warmth, genuineness and congruence. So very much like PCT, being accepting, respectful and non-judgmental, attentiveness to the client, accurate empathy is important. So being able to, know the various different types of emotions that a person could feel and be able to kind of glean from what the person's saying, what it is that that person might be experiencing, and be able to reflect it in a feeling statement is really important. And collaboration, so sharing responsibility for defining problems and solutions. So a key part of CBT is to develop the case formulation. So it's done perhaps in 3 steps. Be clear and specific, and when you make identification and describe the current problem, so find out exactly what it is that's going on and be very clear in regards to the thoughts and feelings that the client's experiencing. And then there's an explanation of how the problem developed. So we're looking for antecedent causes. So what leads to, or what has led to this problem? You might have to go back in time a little bit, but we're not focused on that area. We're really just using that to be able to understand what's happening in the present time. And then we analyse the ways in which the problem is maintained, and this is really important. So we're looking for the cognitive and behavioural processes that keep the problem happening. So this maintenance of behaviour. So what is it that keeps this problem happening? So if a person comes to you and says, look, I can't drive, and I've had many clients say this, I can't drive on busy freeways. I just can't do it. When I go on there, I start to feel really bad. I start to feel panicky, and I need to quickly get off. And when a car comes up behind me, I really slow down. And then they beep the horn at me, and it makes me really upset, and then I have to get off and that sort of stuff. So say, for example, we take that as a problem. So that is the problem. So how is that person, how did that person's problem developed? Well, if I'm thinking of this one client, it developed because the husband used to continuously criticise her driving while she was on the road. They were divorced, and he would criticise her, and she'd get really nervous and upset and flustered, and she'd have to get off, and they'd end up in a big fight. And the whole kind of idea of driving on the freeway to her was not great in the first place, and made worse by this critical husband. So we learn a little bit about what the trigger has been, and then we analyse the way in which the problem is maintained through her cognitive and behavioural processes. So this is how she was maintaining it, by believing that she was a terrible driver. So she allowed herself to believe she's a terrible driver, and because she's a terrible driver, she can't hack it out on the freeway. Okay, and therefore that led to her slowing down and letting other people pass, and sort of driving in a way that was actually causing other people to, honk at her and treat her badly. So it was just reinforcing that stuff. And so that was her cognitions, and her behaviour was that when she would get out there, she would behave in that way that I just described, which reinforced everything. So they were the maintenance behaviours. So what we did was get down to the idea that this belief that she had in herself, which was very, very strong and kind of, it was all or nothing. She is a bad driver, and she can only drive on the quiet roads. She cannot drive on the busy roads. So in identifying the problem, the CBT counsellor will ask specific questions, just as we've done before, and there are 4 different aspects of the issue. So the cognition, so what are you thinking? What comes to mind for the client when they experience the problem? And that might include thoughts, words and images, which are all cognition, so everything that happens in the mind. And what about the emotions? What are you feeling when you experience the problem? Going back to my driver, feeling extreme nervousness to the point of anxiety and sometimes panic. And what's the behaviour? What the client does when the problem happens, including his behaviour preceding, during and after the event. Sort of notice how very, very detailed we need to get with CBT. And so, if you were using this in your case study, you could actually show how you apply these 4 questions to your case study, and kind of what the resulting answers might be, which would lead you then to be able to treat the person using CBT. And so, with my little driver client, her behaviour was to get off the freeway, to slow down, have people honk at her, which then made her feel bad, and then get off the freeway. And the physical response is any bodily response the client experiences as they associate with the problem. And it's important to know physical responses because sometimes they kind of seem to happen either first or simultaneously. And so sometimes the physical problems feed into the thoughts about the problem. So, and this is what was happening to her. She was getting really agitated and her heart would start pounding, and then she'd go, oh my God, I'm going to have a panic attack, or I'm starting to get really anxious. I really am bad. And so the problems just compounded because of the physical symptoms. They sort of seemed to add to the maladaptive cognitions, which led to more emotions and more, of the negative behaviour. And so when we find all of that out, at that point we can start to identify what thoughts need modifying, what thoughts and behaviours need modifying. So CBT focuses on the here and now. Notice I didn't go into her past about her husband, etc., any other trauma or anything like that. I really just got the details of how it seemed to have evolved. So an important principle of CBT is that treatment involves dealing with the symptoms that you're struggling with right now, rather than focusing on the cause of the problem. That's really fundamental. Although it can be interesting to understand how your anxiety developed, just knowing why you have anxiety is not enough to help you manage your anxiety. So this flies in the face of say, person-centered therapy, which, Carl Rogers believed that just being able to talk about it was enough to, sort of let yourself be accepted just as you are, and therefore you wouldn't need to have that maladaptive behaviour anymore, or that anxiety anymore. You could just let it go. Whereas CBT says, no, just knowing is not enough. We'll need to put things in place for the future. So the dog example. Imagine that you're terrified of dogs. So we're thinking about that dog example. Every time you see one, you run the other way because you're convinced that all dogs are vicious beasts and will bite you. Now, if you wanted to understand why you're so afraid of dogs, you might eventually find out that you were bitten by a dog when you were a child, which is no doubt your cause, the cause of your fear of dogs. But here's the problem. Knowing the cause does not change the fact that you're terrified of dogs and running away from them and thinking of them as vicious beasts that bite. So, that supports CBT's idea that, it's just not enough to know what happened. You have to put things in place, which, to the average person, it makes a lot of sense. It makes sense, doesn't it, that just knowing is not enough. What am I going to do about it? Because I still feel bad. So the aims of CBT are therefore to move the clients towards becoming their own therapist and being able to deal with those issues if they resurface. So homework becomes an essential part of the therapy. CBT aims to increase self-awareness and self-insight. It is present-focused rather than past-focused and mandated by Medicare for psychologists working with clients in depression and anxiety, and we've talked about that. So there is a lot of homework associated with CBT. And if you think about it, these 60 minutes or 50 minutes, which is how long a session usually goes for, is really just the psychoeducation. They're getting the problem, kind of into or down on paper and into sort of some sort of framework and perspective. And then maybe collaboratively working with alternative ideas about what I could think, what I could do instead, and so forth. So really, the session is kind of a meeting about what you're going to do in the real world, right? And so the homework then becomes doing the things that you set out within the session. So, for example, my lady who couldn't drive on the freeway, we actually did a technique called gradual exposure. So she went on the freeway for 3 minutes and came off. Then she went on for 5 minutes and came off. She went on for a little longer and came off until she could go, from one entry point to one exit point, all along, using calming and breathing techniques. So I didn't kind of focus very much on what that husband had said to her. We touched on that, and that became some of our conversation, but really it was really just to change that behavior. And so in thinking about that idea that I brought up last week, where our behavior informs us, our behavior can inform our emotions, just by behaving differently, she then started to feel more comfortable about herself, and maybe her thoughts, she became less attached to those difficult thoughts about driving on a freeway. But I didn't really go towards those. I was mainly focused on getting that behavior to change. And like her, there's been many others we just focused on how to do the thing that was difficult to do. CBT places a high importance on conceptualizing presenting issues with the client. And so remember, I'm saying to you, we're working out, what it looks like. Well, that's the conceptualization of the issue. And so we sort of get down to the bottom of what are the thoughts, what are the behaviors, what are the feelings. We make a model of it. This is all that psychoeducation stuff. And as these bullet points say, we increase our understanding of presenting issues, and it helps with relapse prevention, and it also helps with buy-in to the therapy. Because if you have a conceptual understanding of what it is that you're doing with your counsellor, then you can make those kind of rational and logical choices about it, rather than if someone is just doing therapy kind of at you and you're not really sort of understanding the why or the concept behind it. So this is very collaborative in that way, and that collaboration helps with the buy-in, because remember that a client has to be committed. Imagine not being committed and telling your client, or having your client be expected to do that homework. Now you have to get on for 3 minutes and then get up, then you get on for 5 minutes and then get up. The overwhelming fear might stop them from doing it. So that commitment, that buy-in kind of gets them out there, even if it's for just those 3 minutes. So, that model is really important, because it helps the client ultimately achieve what they wanted to achieve. Here are some of the associated sort of symptoms or thoughts related to those 4 key areas that we talked about. The cognitions, emotions, and so forth. So here is an activity that we normally do together, and I'm just going to talk you through it. Just do it for yourself, I would advise. Do it for yourself and come back and share in Moodle how that went, and maybe respond to it. So what I'd like you to do is think of a behavior that you would like to retain. Right? So it's about retaining a particular behavior that you're doing. If you're currently on a diet, or you've just given up smoking, or you're trying to do your routine during COVID-19, it's a good plan, and it's good. And now you're going to plan a relapse strategy for yourself. Now, we haven't talked a lot about relapse, but relapse is the time when you've done the new behavior and it's going well, but you've come off a different maladaptive behavior. So you've done the adaptive behavior for a little while, you're doing well, you're checking in, say with your counsellor, and it's going well. It's positive and it's adaptive. But there is a small chance that you may relapse, because remember, we're not doing anything with what causes it. We're just doing stuff with the behavior itself. So if, for example, you have stopped smoking, and the cause of you smoking seems to be high stress, right? So when you're highly stressed, you like that cigarette because it gives you, and it does, it's sort of a slight anesthetic. It's sort of a bit mind-numbing, and so it kind of makes you feel a little bit better, which it does because of all the chemicals that are in it. And you're kind of addicted to that. But you realize it's all wrong for you, so you've taken up a new behavior, and you are now wanting to keep that behavior. We haven't thought about what triggers it. We've just thought about what the behavior is. Now we want to plan a relapse strategy. So here are the things that we need to include in our relapse strategy. And I would like you to think about this when you're thinking about your case study for your final assessment, and if you choose CBT. Think about and make a little relapse strategy, because relapse is very, very possible. So here are the questions you ask yourself. What situations might prevent you from maintaining the behavior? What could you do to manage a high-risk situation like that? So thinking about our quitter, our cigarette quitter, they're doing well. They've been, 3 months without cigarettes, and coming, sort of back and forward and doing well. But there needs to be a relapse strategy in place, just in case. Now, we know that the situation that might prevent you from maintaining that behavior is high stress. High stress. And we know, for example, with this quitter, that high stress at work leads to them wanting to duck out for a quick cigarette, to feel that, that good feeling that you get from smoking, but at the same time, the guilt and the shame for having gone back. Okay, so what do you do to manage a high-risk situation like that? Well, as the counsellor, you might say, okay, when you get high stress, what you need to do is you need to have a little coping strategy list. And number 1 is going to be, and then you think of what the coping strategy, number 1 coping strategy might be. And say perhaps for this smoker, deep breathing exercises. Connect with self, connect to the moment, and do some very deep breathing exercises, so that calm, that nice calm can come over them, and they can deal with the stress via this brand new technique, rather than the old technique which was going out for a cigarette. Okay, so that might be one of the high risk management things that they could implement. Number 3, what thoughts and feelings do you have when you're most likely to relapse, and what could you do to regulate those thoughts and feelings? So if number 2 is related to behavior, number 3 then is related to cognitions. So when the stressful situation happens, what can you be thinking? What sort of thoughts, can you implement for yourself? And you might have to write them down to regulate the emotions, because stress might lead you to feeling like, oh my God, I'm out of control, I'm going to get the sack, terrible things are going to happen, I'm going to lose, lots of money, etc., etc. And so rather than going into those thoughts, which then lead you to have that cigarette, why not have a different set of thoughts? Maybe they need to be written down as well. That can help you to regulate, because a lot of those thoughts you might recognize as being things that REBT would have said were irrational. I might lose my job and lose thousands of dollars. That's a very big over-dramatization, isn't it? That's a very big thought. Is that really likely to happen? Are things in place that make sure that won't happen? Can you scale down that response, and so it doesn't feel so bad, right? And so you look at all the different types of thoughts and think, how are they, probably bigger than the moment? And so what new thoughts can I put in place? And what supports, number 4, and skills do you have that could help maintain the behavior? And so now we've taken care of alternative behavior, deep breathing, taken care of the new thoughts. Hey, I notice I catastrophize, I'm going to scale those down. And then, what supports do I have? I'm going to go and sit with a colleague just for a second, and that colleague does not smoke, and they make me feel good, and I might just go to them and say, hey, do you want to go into the lunchroom and get a cup of tea or have a drink of water? And maybe just being with them will trigger feelings of calm, and I won't need to go out and have a cigarette. And so what positive consequences can you reward yourself with for maintaining the behavior? And these positive consequences are really really good. They're external reinforcements, and they can work because the external reinforcement then becomes associated with the new behavior. So the external reinforcement or the reward that you give yourself might be that instead of smoking, instead of spending $50 on a bag of cigarettes, you allocate that $50 to something else, an activity that you really like, or buying something, or whatever it is, right? It might be monetary, but it could be something else. So this relapse strategy is it's fundamental in CBT because relapse is always, pretty much guaranteed, because we're not dealing with what triggers it, right? We're not trying to take that away. We can't take away the stress of work. Stress, it just is. There are certain things you can control and there are certain things you can't. CBT says the only stuff you can control is yourself. So you've got to be doing those things, the things that are within your control. Okay. So then the purpose of the CBT model is to understand the cognitive behavior model is part of the collaborative relationship in CBT. So the cognitive model becomes the common map that both clinician and the client work from, and it's essential that the client understands the model of cognition, feelings, and behaviour. So we're just talking about psychoeducation there. Psychoeducation is a CBT strategy for both, helping the person understand his or her problems within a cognitive framework and bringing the person to trust the process of the model. So that's the purpose of the model. It builds trust and understanding. So psychoeducation builds trust and understanding, and that's why this model is so accessible to most people. So the techniques, CBT uses practical techniques to alter behaviours and thinking to influence feeling and emotion, and the techniques are tailored to the client's needs and the nature of the disorder. So, as we know, one size does not fit all disorders, and approaches are tailored by the specific characteristics of the disorder. And so when we talk about disorders, we're talking about anxiety, depression, panic, stress, etc. And so CBT is a goal-focused therapy. We're not talking about the past. We're not talking about what happened way back when and sort of trying to figure it out. We're talking about where you want to be. I want to quit smoking. I want to quit drinking. I want to have better relationships. I want to drive on the freeway. Okay, goal-focused. And both client and therapist agree upon the therapeutic goal and use strategies aimed at achieving the goal. So basically the techniques are all geared towards helping the client achieve their goal. And so the entry point, as we've discussed, is identifying the behaviours. So it's always wise to identify the most evident and worrying behaviours first up, and the client will be more aware of unhelpful behaviours and less aware of consequent aspects connected with these behaviours, which are the thoughts and feelings. And so that's why psychoeducation works, because you want to make people aware. So investigating the person's behaviours will be the easiest first step to achieving aspects of their therapeutic goals. And it may help to bring about immediate improvements to a client's function. So once you identify the behaviours, a client might have a light bulb moment. Hey, yeah, that is what I do. Hey, yeah, when I get stressed, I do just grab the cigarettes. I don't think about breathing. I don't think about alternative thoughts, or that I'm overgeneralizing, or that I'm over-catastrophizing. They have these kind of light bulb moments. And then, behaviour change can happen. So behaviour change is usually achieved through behavioural activation, behavioural experiments, and even activity schedules, which we'll go through in a moment. So each is effective for improving the mood of a client and reducing symptoms of anxiety and distress, and these are based upon the principles of operant conditioning. And so operant conditioning says that when we do something and are rewarded, we tend to change towards that new behaviour, towards the behaviour that's being rewarded. So behavioural action, create a schedule of activities that will lead to you having positive experiences in your day. So here's a behavioural activation schedule. You can see what it is. It's got Monday to Sunday. What do we do in the morning, afternoon, in the evening? And these tend to be for people who are depressed. So depressive clients, in order for them to reintroduce positive behavior or adaptive behavior into their life, because your depressive client will no doubt have the types of behavior or be exhibiting or doing sort of behavior that leads to further depression. So not getting up, not getting out of bed, not leaving the house, all just contributes to more and more. Whereas if we put them on a behavioural activation schedule to say, okay, I would like you to eat, breakfast, and then in the afternoon go for a short tiny walk. And when they write it down, it becomes a bit of a measure and a bit of a confirmation that their behaviour is changing, which then could lead to further positive behaviour. And they can do that every day. Also, a thought journal is another tool that you could use sort of for people. A thought journal would be really good for in a relapse schedule. So when you do feel like relaxing, write down what your thoughts were. What was the activating event? So my boss came in and slammed a whole lot of stuff down on my desk and said, this needs to be done in an hour. Well, that caused me stress. So my beliefs were, I couldn't do it. I can't do it. It's too short. I'm already overwhelmed. And the consequence was that I went out and had or wanted to have cigarettes. And so in order to stop, so I'm just doing this in terms of a relapse schedule, but you could apply it to the actual behavioural change. And so the disputing thoughts, as we learnt with REBT, if you remember A, B, C, and D, as you notice there, we've got the A for activating event, the B for the belief, the C for the consequence, and D for disputing. So disputing that belief might be that we challenge the thinking. Is it actually true that you won't be able to do this? Are you alone in the organisation that it is just you? And if it is just you, and if you won't be able to do it, do you need to catastrophize, or is there an opportunity for you to say, hey, this is actually real, I'm going to go and have a talk to my boss? So it allows for reflection, remembering that most people just go from go to woe. Boss slams things down, go out for a cigarette. It's all done in kind of one movement, one action. And so this thought journal breaks things up, makes you slow down, makes you recognize what the different aspects were of, that lead you to the behavior or the consequence, if you like. Here is a person's record of dysfunctional thoughts. We've got sad, anxious, and depressed there on the left in the first column. What happened when they were sad? They sat in front of the television the whole evening and did nothing. And their automatic thoughts, I will never get a job, I can't even do anything. But then they said, how do I dispute those automatic thoughts? Well, you can do that with alternative responses. There is no evidence as to why, as I've not even tried to look for a job, right? And I'm still ill at the moment, but my illness is improving and soon I might be able to go back. And so the outcome of the automatic thought. So we then look back at the automatic thought once we've done that alternate response, and we see how true that is for us. And apparently it went down from 80 to 40%. And the emotion was re-rated at 20%. So in other words, we went from 80% sad down to 20% sad. So on the left, pretty much you've got, the original automatic type stuff that you think, and then when you actively rethink or reframe the situation or bring new thoughts in, then you re-rate how you felt. And apparently, the sadness had decreased. So you can read those for yourself. And so these unhelpful thinking styles, for example, this one here, I'll never get a job, I can't do anything. These unhelpful thinking styles are the main focus of CBT. And we call them in CBT distorted thinking or maladaptive thinking styles. And distorted thinking is thinking that is kind of bent out of shape or irrational, as per REBT. And this type of thinking might not have logical sequence, but might have might not have a logical sequence, but will lack evidence and proof, and will lack evidence and proof. So distorted thinking can be recognized in its distinctly personal nature and using I sentences, and is usually irrational. And we tend not to use irrational, we tend to use maladaptive. So distorted thinking is usually negative, global, stable, and external, i.e. things will never change no matter what I do. It is the other person's fault that I am like this. So it tends to be, you'll recognize it in your client because it tends to be just so unmovable. It's something they believe, and they believe it wholeheartedly. And it's a thought that, if you like, has deep roots. It's deep, deep roots, but it is distorted. And so, they live their life continuously, with this thought. And so no wonder they feel certain things like anxiety or depression. This thought needs to be addressed. So the unhelpful thinking style might start with the triggering event. Can be anything that results in negative thoughts and emotions. So you might get stuck in traffic, or you might get criticised, as it said here, or contradicted, or something that just triggers you, because you have that deep entrenched thinking style. And then negative thoughts will be associated to it. So that idiot pushed in, I hate my job, how dare they talk to me that way, etc., etc. And then you give an emotional response. And the emotional response could be anger, if we're thinking about, someone, being stuck in traffic. And then you get physical sensations, which we talked about, increased heart rate and so forth. And then the behavioural response, which could be to physically or verbally attack, or start screaming, or whatever it is. So unhelpful thinking styles, tend to be a part of a person who experiences quite a bit of maybe anxiety or quite a bit of stress. And these are the unhelpful thinking styles. And some of these, all of these relate to REBT because they're all sort of thought of as irrational. But if you have a look at some of those, they're kind of interesting. And I think it's always interesting to think, which ones are my favourites? Am I an all or nothing type of person? Sometimes called black and white thinking. I'm not perfect, I have failed. Either I do it right or not at all. And that applies to others as well. Either they are perfect or they are bad. There's no kind of middle ground. Those top two are the main ones. Or overgeneralizing, everything is always rubbish. Nothing good ever happens. So, not true. It's just not true. There has never, there is never, really. That's probably the only time that it's true. The mental filter, where you only pay attention to certain types of evidence. So we notice our failures, but we don't see our success. So people who have mental filters are very hard on themselves all the time. I didn't do as well in that as I could have. I'm letting myself down. But we did well in the others. Why aren't you looking at that? Perhaps you can go through these with your lecturer. And so what we do then, once we identify which one of these your client is tending towards, then we look at this notion of restructuring. And so that is part of the plan to do some cognitive restructuring. We do reframing, cognitive reframing, or rational counselling, as it says there on your screen. So it does have a variety of names, but really what we're doing here is to say that thinking doesn't help you. That type of mental filtering doesn't help you. It makes you feel bad. Let's look at that. Let's restructure that or reframe that thinking so that it leads to you feeling better about yourself. And it's not at all telling yourself a lie. What it is realizing that you're having, the type of thought that is not real. It's maladaptive and it may well be irrational. So, once clients can maintain a thought record and identify their unhelpful thought patterns through labeling them, they are usually ready to learn how to engage in cognitive restructuring. So that is the next part. Remember I said to you that these sessions are more like meetings, kind of, sort of trying to figure out what my client is going to do out in the real world, the homework. And so part of that could be, or one of those meetings could be, to do cognitive restructuring. And this is what separates CBT from other therapies, where we focus on changing and challenging the way that we think. Maybe other therapies that are not, related to cognitive stuff, like psychodynamic therapy, psychoanalysis. It is a deceptively easy and simple strategy, but it takes a significant amount of work to be effective. So cognitive restructuring is all about disputing a client's maladaptive beliefs and thoughts in a strategic and inquisitive manner. Core component of CBT, deceptively simple strategies but can be extremely effective, and we use several techniques like Socratic questioning, evidence for and against, pros and cons, and decatastrophizing. So that final bullet point is the main one I want you to focus on. This is the sort of stuff that you would include in your final assessment as part of how you dealt with this particular case. So you identified all the issues, you identified the behaviour, you identified the thought patterns that were maladaptive, negative, irrational, and now you created, some cognitive restructuring with your client. So, and these are the techniques that you might have used. So Socratic questioning, here's an example of Socratic. It's sort of asking, it's sort of trying to get down to the core. So this soup is awful, and if that were true, what would that mean to you? Well, it would mean that I'm a terrible cook, and if that was the case, what would that mean to you? Well, if I'm a terrible cook, that means I'm not providing for my family, so maybe I'm a bad mother, and if that were true, what would that mean to you? That I'm a failure. I'm actually a failure at everything, and now we've reached the patient's core belief. And that's an example of downward arrow technique, Socratic questioning. So we're always trying to peel away and kind of get down to the core belief. It's not about soup, it's about being a failure. And that can lead to, okay, let's refine those beliefs. What is that really true, that you're a failure? Well, no, because you've been a success at so many other things. It might just mean, that you need to, think differently about yourself. And so cognitive restructuring is focused upon challenging irrational thinking styles that are central to a client's presenting issues, and people often don't realise that they manage to cope in adverse situations. And so in order to help us, sort of we had the techniques there, Socratic questioning, which we just talked about. Now the next one is evidence for and against. So we look for evidence that they've done it before, that they have coped before in different situations. So thinking about, my client who didn't want to go on the freeway, have there been times in, when there's been really busy traffic and you've done fine? Yeah, of course there has, on the highway, not the freeway, the highway. That's 80, that's pretty fast. And yet she was flying along there, no problem. It was just this concept of freeway. But why should it be so? Why is it so that you can't apply that same coping strategy to the freeway? And so, I know that we did some of that restructuring based on, coping in similar situations. So eliciting the existing strengths of a client rather than pointing out their weaknesses. How did you cope elsewhere? How do you do this elsewhere really well? Cognitive restructuring is not about positive thinking, it's about rational thinking. I had another client who had been looking for work for a long time, and she had suffered anxiety, but she was ready to go back, and she said, I have no confidence. I just have no self-confidence. I can't possibly get a job. And I said to her, what are the other areas of your life in which you are kind of confident about? Oh, well, I have grandchildren and they're terrific. They love me. I make Sunday, roast for them every Sunday, and I have a group of friends that I go out with. And I said, so, here it is. You do well in other areas of your life. Is it true then that you are, you lack confidence all over the place? In other words, she's an overgeneralizer. No, you just lack confidence in this area. But you are so good at other things, you're so good at relationships, and you're so good at taking care of people, maybe you could apply those, coping strategies or those strengths to finding a job. And she did. Not that easily, but we definitely got her to reframe this whole idea of self-confidence. And here's a little sheet, Socratic questioning. So we may then, through Socratic questioning, get down to the core beliefs. So the core beliefs is sort of one of the final stages, and not necessarily a stage that everybody gets to with CBT. And they are beliefs that people hold about themselves and their place in the world. I am a failure. I am not good enough. These very fundamental, aching, really difficult beliefs to hold. They have very deep roots, and they come from early experiences in most cases. And they are important to therapy due to unconscious influence, and they exert upon a client's thinking, behaviours, and emotional state. So remembering that we said that is not the goal of CBT. The goal of CBT is to have goals, recovery, activating, adaptive behaviours and so forth. That's the goal. It's not to get to and change the core belief. But sometimes that can actually happen through, the work that you do. And here on the right there, the core beliefs are like magnets. They're always waiting to attract evidence. So this person has the core belief of I'm stupid. Now, where does someone get that core belief from? You are not born with that core belief. That is developed over time and with reinforcement from people in your life. And so those core beliefs lead to you trying to find evidence of that in your life. In other words, I failed my exam when I was 15. I'm dyslexic. My teachers at school, what does it say there, said I'd never amount to anything. I lose my temper and I shout at my children. I am stupid. See? Here's all the evidence. Whereas there's also evidence when you are using strengths-based, kind of behaviour type therapy, you can also show them, but hang on, you've also successfully run your own business. You won the, I don't know, let's say a hub quiz with your friends, and your hobby is photography, and you're successful at it. So that's what we do when we get to core beliefs and we find out, what this person has, some sort of deep rooted belief. We, as in CBT, look for those strengths which can disprove, the core belief. It can render it pretty much void. Here's a little way of conceptualizing core beliefs. You might have inherited them or gained them through early learning, your parents. And then activating events prove them or support them. And here, here, it leads to the current thinking. So it's activating events which have supported these biological and early learnings. And that's why your core beliefs dictate the current thinking and lead to certain behaviours and emotions. So the treatment plan might run like this: an assessment in session 1, a CBT conceptualization and psychoeducation, which we've discussed in session 2. Then we're looking for behavioural change. We might implement the activity schedule, relaxation techniques, sleep hygiene. We haven't talked a lot about relaxation techniques, but I did discuss them briefly with our relapse plan, sort of as an alternative to maybe smoking. But relaxation techniques are a wonderful alternative to all sorts of, kind of fight type of behaviour. That I have to do, sort of going off the handle or feeling deep anxiety or, getting that panic. So instead of doing that kind of behaviour, we do relaxation instead. So they're really good techniques to learn. As part of the overall plan, we might want thought journaling just so we can catch, some of these distorted thinking in action and how we can reframe them. And then in session 5, we might do unhelpful thinking style. So we might get to the bottom of, what's your favorite? You seem to always overgeneralize, or you seem to do a lot of black and white thinking, or mental filters. And that was that list with the little pictures, which you should go through with your lecturer. And then we do cognitive restructuring. So it's, how can we dispute? How can we find evidence? How can we use your strengths to help you to give less power to those intensely rooted negative thoughts that you've got, which might lead to, core beliefs work. And it doesn't always end up there, but it could do. So CBT is therefore structured and educational. It involves learning new ways to think about and understand symptoms, and because of this, sessions are structured, so they're usually reviewing the homework that you did or learning new information and skills, and then developing a new homework assignment for the next session. So remember that plan, or that concept that I mentioned, where really we're doing the work here for you to then go out into the world and make it happen. CBT is obviously collaborative because you're learning the new skills. It's very active. You've got to get out there and do it. If you don't commit to it, well, you're kind of just wasting your money. We're really just talking here. It's one of those very action-oriented talk therapies, which is why it's been researched so much, because the techniques are fairly prescriptive. This is what you do then, this is what you do now, and what you do then, and so forth. And so it can be replicated to produce the outcomes that we're looking for. So, that's why it's so well researched and supported. And you can expect to participate both in and out of session to see the positive changes it's given. It's also time limited, as you notice. There's around 8 sessions is normal, because you've got these prescriptive things that you need to do, and once they're done and the client has done the homework, it is a reliable assumption that the client will have engaged in and be ready with their new behaviours. Now, one of the things that it doesn't go through there is creating a relapse. Creating a relapse plan, and I think it's important to do a relapse plan. It is not supposed to be lifelong, rather you're supposed to be learning to become your own therapist. Again, it is a self-help type therapy. And once you've learned new skills, had a chance to master them and see positive changes in your life, it will be time for you to leave therapy and continue to manage anxiety or depression or stress or whatever it is on your own. So some of the strengths and limitations of CBT, you might have noticed some of the strengths already. It is, the second one there we just talked about. It is something you can do very actively. You commit to it. It's fairly short term. If you get a very good, strong CBT therapist, they will have those kind of prescriptive sort of things that you can do for particular ailments or particular concerns, and you go off and you do them. Exposure therapy, etc. The Socratic questioning and so forth. These things work. They're evidence-based, so that's a real pro. And research has shown that CBT can be as effective as medicine in treating depression and other health problems. So again, the research, that's really just pointing to the strength of CBT when it's tested in research, has been shown. It has been shown to work. So that's a really big pro, because not a lot of other therapies can say that. The cons, however, are that you need to commit yourself to the process to get the most from it. Your client must commit. If they are not willing to do homework, they are wasting their time, because all the work happens outside of the, the therapeutic session, really. Well, not all the work, but, a lot of the work, the discussions and the revelations happen within the session, and they might help, but as we know, CBT says it's, that doesn't help at all. you need more. You need to actually, create goals so that you can move forward. Therapeutic benefits are very reliant on the expertise of the counsellor. So this has been shown in research that CBT is really, really good, but you have to have a very well-trained and experienced counsellor, and I talked about that earlier. And attending regular CBT sessions and carrying out any extra work between sessions can take up a lot of your time, but how much do you want to give up smoking? How much do you want to feel better? How much do you want to be able to cope with stress? So it's really about commitment again. And that is it. So that is CBT in a bit of a nutshell. We touched on most concepts. I hope that you found them interesting. Please refer all your questions and maybe go back through the lecture slides yourself to create some reflection or some a reflective piece to add to Moodle in relation to some of the questions that were put up there. Okay, hope you enjoyed it.